Welcome to the Predictable Revenue Podcast, where sales leaders teach you what's working for them and how you can build it yourself.
This episode of the Predictable Revenue Podcast is brought to you by our sales coaching and consulting services. Are you looking to create repeatable, scalable, and predictable revenue? We've helped thousands of companies grow their business with tailored expert advice backed by testing to ensure they establish the best practices that'll work for them. Head over to bit.ly/predictable revenue coaching to learn more. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Predictable Revenue Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about salespeople and more particularly the way that they should be conducting sales today. There are a lot of always conflicting pieces of information, conflicting methodologies, different things that are kind of being shouted at salespeople from all different directions. And a lot of what is being told to them these days is about process, like systems, processes, becoming scalable, all that type of stuff. However, what is more important than that and remains more important than that is being human, because processes don't win deals, people do. So that is exactly what we're going to talk about this week. I'm your host, Sarah Hicks, and today on the Predictable Revenue Podcast, I'm going to be chatting with an expert about how to sell without selling out. His hit Accelerate Your Sales podcast was acquired by Ring DNA in 2020. The since renamed show continues to inspire thousands of sales professionals each week. He's written 2 award-winning sales books, Zero Time Selling and Amp Up Your Sales. He's ranked number 8 in LinkedIn's list of top 50 global sales experts, and he's consulted with some of the biggest businesses in the world, including Square, Philips, Grubhub, and more, making him one of the leading voices in the sales industry today. And he's got a new book. It might just be sitting right here. We'll talk about it in just a little bit. Andy Paul, welcome to the Predictable Revenue Podcast.
Well, Sarah, thank you very much. Thank you for that nice introduction.
Of course. Well, let's just dive right into this. Tell me, what do you mean by selling out in this context?
Selling out in this context, I think we all recognize sort of these stereotypical sales behaviors, whether they're portrayed in movies, TV shows, or whatever. And we've increasingly experienced them in real life, right? I think none of us escape from it. And we could, as a point I started making in the book, is we could do away with those behaviors. We could go cold turkey in the sales industry on those behaviors today, and no one would be the worse off for it, because these are behaviors that buyers instinctively resist. We have no value for the buyers. If they have no value for the buyers, by definition, they have no value for you as a seller.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Tell me some examples of these bad behaviors, bad habits.
Well, I mean, one is, give you one that happened to me, for instance, is, again, message in my LinkedIn inbox, I don't know, about roughly a year ago, something like that. And for people who don't know, you mentioned I have a podcast. We're up to 1,035, 36 episodes, something like that. And this person messaged me and says, I've looked at your LinkedIn profile. And this was a LinkedIn message. I've looked on your LinkedIn profile. I think you'd be the perfect candidate to start a podcast. And it's like, okay. So many things wrong with this. I actually responded to the person. Normally I don't respond, but it was just like, you're on LinkedIn. You said you looked at my profile, which clearly you didn't do, because it's all about at that point, it's all about the podcast. It wasn't so easy, right? Just to spend 10 seconds, 15 seconds. The response was, we don't have time for that. Talking for an entire sales organization. I don't know how big it was, but some agency. But it's like, this is not atypical, right? We get messages like this all the time. They're all self-interested, a little bit pushy, offended that you're not interested. I've got the solution, so you must have the problem. And from there all the way down to behaviors like we see on Wolf of Wall Street and other movies, still replicated today. And we're on the receiving end of, everybody gets this call about extending your auto warranty. I don't know if you do in Canada, in the United States, sort of epidemic of robot calls now to extend our auto warranties. And again, why are we doing them? They don't work. Don't work, right? I mean, people buy off of bad behavior, some percentage, but in general, they just don't work. And it's what's given sales this reputation that is simultaneously both unfair and somewhat deserved. And so what I observe is that, we're actually, in many cases, we're doing more of those behaviors, and we have the opportunity to do it less. And I actually think the technology that we use should enable us to be better at selling than we were and have been. So the book was sort of written to say, look, That's selling out. The opposite of that, in my mind, is what I call selling in. What I've done, what many other people do, is let's do more of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So why do you think, if we're kind of aware of these behaviors that we know if we put ourselves in kind of the buyer's shoes, we wouldn't like that behavior? Even that person that sent you that LinkedIn message has got to know that if they were on the receiving end of a completely fake personalized, like uncustomized, but claiming to be personalized message, they wouldn't like it. It's not going to make them want to buy. And I think that's true of a lot of these behaviors that salespeople are out doing. They get that this wouldn't be kind of pleasant on the other end. So why are so many salespeople and sales teams still stuck in those selling out behaviors?
It's a great question, right? I mean, you'd think that we'd know better by now, but it's the way we continue to socialize and train sellers by and large. And so I addressed this in the book. I said that I think it starts from this idea of what is your perspective of what your job is as a seller? And the common conception is, and I like when I speak to groups and I'll ask this question, people raise hands. Generally, salespeople think their job is to go out and persuade somebody to buy their product. And if you think that's your job, then it's almost like sort of a zero-sum game, right? Is you're right. If the buyer doesn't agree with you, they're sort of wrong, right? You've got a solution. They therefore must have the problem. And I believe that what selling is about is not something you do to a buyer, it's something you do with a buyer. And so I think, as I define in the book, is selling in, the opposite of selling out, is your job is to go out and listen to your buyer and make sure you understand what's most important to them relative to the challenges they face and the outcomes they want to achieve, and then help them get that. And that's going to take you on a different path in terms of how you work with the buyer, something you do collaboratively within. And I do believe selling is the ultimate act of collaboration if done well with your buyer.
Absolutely. So tell me about how a leader can kind of identify these, I guess, behaviors in their team and start to lead a team that is doing the opposite, selling in instead of selling out.
Well, the leader has to be committed to saying, look, we've got a problem, which is the problem is that the way the buyer is experiencing our sellers isn't good, right? And how do we know that? I mean, in certain industries, SaaS is oftentimes among these, is that we're operating with win rates that are really low. Right. So of our qualified opportunities, maybe it's not unusual in SaaS win rates in the low 20%. So we're closing 1 out of every 4, every 5 are most qualified opportunities. That's the buyer's referendum on how well they experience the sales, the sales journey, the buying journey with the seller. And the referendum is, we're failing it. We're not passing it. So we have to start with that recognition, is that the way buyers are experience us is suboptimal, and that we could do so much better. Trouble is that managers sort of get locked into a process. The process is sort of, oftentimes managers come into a situation, the plane is in flight. How do I fix the plane when we're in the air? And that's the big challenge. So I think that part is really a culture change that has to take place from leaders to recognize that buyers are saying we're not doing a very good job of this. And it's one thing when your company was sort of endless runway, you've got the funds, you can, maybe you're a high growth startup, you've got a lot of money, you can sort of say, we're just going to focus on top of funnel and we'll just worry about closing a relatively small percentage of the opportunities that come through. But at some point, things change. Not all companies have the benefit of operating that way. The economy could change, in which case, we've been in sort of period of 14 years of uninterrupted economic growth, where companies actually have to force to learn how to actually sell, meaning that when they have an opportunity that really is qualified, they have to be able to close it and learn how to win. Because if you're only closing 1 of, let's say, 4 of your most qualified opportunities, what are you training your salespeople to do? Now, what's the experience they're getting the most practice at? They're getting the most practice at not winning. And I think that's problematic.
Yeah. Interesting. Absolutely. So what are kind of the steps, if we're thinking from the seller's perspective, what are the steps that you should take to learn to sell in? And I know that this is a piece also that's mentioned in your book, the kind of pillars of selling in.
Right. So I talk about 4 pillars of selling in: connection, curiosity, understanding, and generosity. And when I contrast them with the behaviors that we see as the salesy behaviors, is those sales behaviors, those are learned behaviors, right? We teach people how to do that. No one, I think, is, pops out at birth and, they're pushy and persuasive and, self-interested in the same degree. But we are wired to connect, right? We are social animals. We're wired to want to build rapport and connection with another person. We're wired to want to be trusted. We're wired to be curious. It's our curiosity that enables us to navigate the world, from youth to, in business, and to encounter a new situation with a different type of buyer. It's our curiosity that enables us to, to navigate through that. It's our understanding that's so critical. We're wired to want to understand because we want to be aware of what's happening around us. We want to understand other people. And we're wired to give. Again, by social tribal animals, giving makes us feel good. So these are natural behaviors. And the point I make in the book is that I quote from Jeff Colvin's book, Humans Are Underrated, where he talks about in an increasingly digital future, the people who thrive are those who learn how to become more intensely human, meaning that we're going to continue down this path with the differentiation between products is so slim. Is what becomes the differentiator? What becomes the buyer's experience with you as a person, as a seller? And so we need to learn how to be able to optimize that. We need to learn how to be able to connect with the buyer and build trust so they'll open the door to us to ask deeper, more penetrating questions so we can deploy our curiosity. I mean, you've experienced this in sales is you can ask a question of a buyer. If you don't have that level of trust, they may give you an answer, but they're not necessarily opening the door for you to ask a good follow-up question, to go a little bit deeper and dig a little deeper. And the goal that you're trying to do with connection, with your curiosity or connection, is to have the buyer say, look, I'm going to give you permission to stick your nose into my business, right? At a level that other sellers won't be able to get without that trust. So then when we're given that permission, then we want to ask the right types of questions that enable us to really uncover what's most important to the buyer. Because too often now in discovery motions and sales, there's a playbook and we've got these questions we ask and we're going to gather this information. And it's really the equivalent of taking a survey. We're going to check the boxes. Yeah, I got that answer. Fine, you've got some information. What do you really understand about the buyer? What do you understand with the context of that information that you have? And too many sellers just give up because they say, well, these are the questions I'm supposed to ask. But you got to go a step further. And then when you do that further builds the relationship and the connection with the buyer, trust. They say these people have some acumen, they've got value they're adding to us. You get to that level of understanding. When you get that level of understanding, then okay, we've got a target. What are we trying to achieve with the buyer? How can we help them get to that point? If you're just persuasion based, you don't really care about the target because given your job, you're going to say, I'm going to sell before I understand because I've only got one thing to push.
Interesting. There's going back to your point about while kind of competition in the product world gets fiercer and fiercer, and really any feature set that one company is going to do, the next one's going to do in the space of about 3 months, like where they maybe differentiate on on other things, that playing field will level more and more as time goes on. And you kind of bring up a great thought. And I have an example essentially of this thing that has occurred in my career very recently in kind of the recommendations that I make to clients on the coaching consulting side. So I won't go into the names of the products themselves, but there are 2 top sales enablement tools or sales engagement tools that exist out in the market right now. I have used one a lot. I use it. I think it's great in terms of features. It does all the things I need to do. But the ability to get in touch with a human at this particular tool is it's abysmal, to be honest. And so I actually have recommended the competing tool, knowing that its features are neck and neck. It is building everything that the other tool is doing because it knows that that's the top competition. And in fact, what is then more important is the human element. So obviously that's more of a kind of customer success example, but it's the same principle.
Well, and just to give another example, it's not necessarily directly like that, but it's about the human aspect of it. Is again, a story I tell in the book is, worked for startups for a long time and was selling large, complex communication systems, competing against really big companies. And we were, no track record, no brand name type people. or type company. But the reason, this one I talk about the book, I asked the customer, why did you decide to buy from us? Because it wasn't intuitively obvious to me that we would win. She said, because you made us feel understood. That's a human thing, right? You're making people feel heard and understood is a tremendous source of value to buyers. Because then they say, yeah, we're in this on the right path with this particular company, right? You think about it, yeah, a lot of people don't focus on understanding. They focus about knowing stuff. And so I talk about in the book is there's this gap between knowing and understanding. It's one that we have to cross. And again, too often sellers don't. So they have this sort of superficial knowledge we're trying to deploy to help the customer to some end that we're not really certain what that end is. Well, if you're competing against another seller that's reached that level of understanding and has put together this vision for success, what success would look like for the buyer, yeah, if you don't have that, you're fighting for second place.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'm obviously all on board with the idea of the human element being absolutely the most important thing. But I'm going to play devil's advocate here because I know that somebody might be thinking, in terms of a sales team, if we're thinking about a scaling organization, knowing that human individuality is the least scalable thing, and what we can end up with in some orgs is that like maverick salesperson who it's their own sort of je ne sais quoi that's like letting them, be good at asking those questions, great at forging those relationships, all those types of things. And a sales manager listening to this might think, okay, well, how do I possibly train and scale the human element if I'm attempting to kind of scale this sales org? So what do you say to that?
Well, it's a harder job for sales managers. And I think part of the reason they are reluctant to do this is because it's a harder job. It requires more of them. Is that if you want to, I talk about this in the book, if you want to make the transition from being just a sales boss to being a sales leader, then what you need to do is understand that your success is completely dependent on the success of the individuals. And the fact of the matter is already, even though there's an emphasis on compliance to process, is that if you have, let's just say 5 million salespeople in the United States, there are 5 million unique ways of selling. And your job as a manager is to say, well, how can I help this person become the best version of themselves? Because if I do that, then they're going to be more fulfilled. If I give them some agency over the choices they make about how they sell, again, you have a framework, you have a process as a framework, but you have to give people latitude within that to experiment and find out what works best for them. Otherwise, we are creating clones of sellers, and they're just not very effective. Right? We have this great technology that's out there. Let's say conversational intelligence, great technology. But if it's used improperly, if it's used to say, look, we've got our team, we want you all to be like Jane. They can't be like Jane because they're not Jane. It doesn't matter. They can listen to Jane's call a dozen times. They're not going to do it the same way. So we have to say, how can we help you become this best version of yourself? It requires a little more investment of time on the part of the manager. And they have to think about the sellers the way they would think about the customers. What's most important? I got to listen. What's most important to this person? What's the most important thing for them? What do they want to achieve? And how can I help them achieve that? And if I take that approach as a manager and as a coach, then I give people more agency over the choices they make, as I said before, about how they sell. Then I get people who become, and there's science behind this, is you give people control over their choices. They make better choices. They are more productive. They're more fulfilled. In the case of sellers, they'll stick around longer, which is hugely important, right? If we can not minimize, but we could reduce the level of churn in sales organizations, tremendous costs, right? And trying to recruit people and onboard them and bring them up to speed. This is one way to do that as a manager, is to lean into this approach. Yeah, I've had questions. People say, well, yeah, we're trying to scale quickly and yeah, we got to move deals through the pipeline. Well, sure. But what I'm describing in the book is a way that actually shortens decision cycles, right? If you put the emphasis on, look, we're going to invest a little more time, make sure we truly understand what's most important to the buyer. We identify the appropriate place we're trying to head. If you do that more quickly, you are going to ultimately end up shortening the amount of time the buyer spends in making the decision. So it's not antithetical to scaling. It's actually a better way to scale.
Yeah, makes sense. So what do you think the kind of first step is for whether it's sales leaders or sales practitioners that are listening right now that want to make this type of change? What is the first thing that they can go out and do right as soon as they stop listening to this episode?
Buy my book, read the book. Well, I mean, I think you look at change in multiple levels. And the first level is just, let's change our perspective about what we're doing. And that really comes from reading the book and engaging in the content we're created around that, because that just, the book is a little bit of reset for some people. And tremendous amount of feedback already. It's like, there's the reset aspect. And then there's also just been a wave of people saying, this is the way I want to sell. And I've been trying to do it, but I feel this pressure to sort of conform. And hopefully it gives people sort of the courage to say, look, go to your boss, hold me accountable for the results, but I've got to do this just a little bit differently, because this is going to be the best version of me doing this. So not to be too self-serving, read the book. I think it is a good way to start, but then have a discussion about internally is what is the culture you're trying to set within the organization. And again, I think there's been too much of a blind obedience to process. And you brought up earlier that people sell, not process. And it's really true. Process is important, right? But what is the process we're trying to set? I think one of the things, especially in smaller companies that perhaps aren't in flight, as we talked about before, they're earlier in their development. I would pose the question, right? Is what's engineer your process to the outcome you want to achieve, which is, look, I want to be able to say, look, we can win a majority of the opportunities, the qualified opportunities we have, which is a realistic goal for every company should be. So let's start there. Let's start a process defining what that process would be to enable us to hit that. And then we'll scale once we really know how to sell our product. And I think that's really sort of the hallmark. I think if your win rates are too low, as we talked about before, either you don't have product market fit or you really don't know how to sell your product. And it requires us having a conversation, say, what could we be doing better? One thing that's missing in that conversation for most companies is they don't go out and ask their buyers, what do you need from us in order to make a decision? I mean, we've got tons of content we've been producing and that buyers can access, but no one really goes out and says, look, okay, buyers, from Challenger and Forrester and other people, that, the majority of the purchase decisions based on interaction with sellers. What does that interaction feel like to you as a buyer? And what could we do better in that regard? But there's that whole side of the equation that we just don't talk to. We don't really understand. I would challenge most sales leaders to go out and ask their buyers, why did you buy from us? It's not feature. I'm talking about one loss analysis feature, price, product, but what about the interaction with the salesperson? Worked for you? What didn't work for you? What didn't help you? What didn't enable you to make progress toward making a decision on a timely basis? Now, when you're armed with that information, then you have some, information and data that you can act on. And I would say the same thing when it comes to hiring, right? Too often I talk to sales leaders that, put together job descriptions for what they want to hire, and they've got these attributes they've listed, and I'll ask them, well, have you ever asked your buyer what they need from you? Do they need a person to be, an extrovert, a hunter, a closer? I mean, do they need any of that? And they have no idea.
That's a great point. Yeah. Is there a bit on that in the book?
No, I've written about that elsewhere.
Okay.
but that's part of additional content we're creating, around the book is what are we looking at this from the buyer's perspective? Mm-hmm. We're just fundamentally out of alignment with our buyers, and this is nothing new. This has been around forever, right? As we look at sales as this linear stage-based process that we go through. And the buyer, if you look at like the Gartner study on buyer enablement, where they've got the famous spaghetti diagram with the flow chart with lines going crazily all over, for the buyer, it's this chaotic, recursive process that's not linear at all. And so I think as long as those things aren't reconciled, there should be one process, we'll call it, that where the stages are the same for the buyer and seller. with different names. They'll have different names. I sort of simplified in sort of a 3-stage process myself. It's if you think about it, it's what I call the what, how, and the who. Is the first stage is the what. The buyer's trying to understand, what are we doing? What's our problem? There's an assumption going in that oftentimes on parts of sellers, that buyers know exactly what the problems are, but that's part of the why they want to talk to a seller, to help them get smarter about what their problem and challenges might be, not just what the solution might be, but they need to be helped about getting smarter about the solution. So there's that first stage is buyers go through us, and it sort of aligns with what Gartner wrote. It's a what stage. What are we trying to do? What's the problem? What are we trying to do? Yet, if you're a persuasion-based seller, you go into that stage saying, buy my product, buy my product, buy my product, before you understand anything. And that's why this comes across as salesy. Next stage is how. Okay, now we know what the what is. What are the alternatives in the market for us to achieve what we want, the outcomes we want to achieve, solve the problem, and achieve our outcomes? How are we going to get that done? And at that stage, buyers formulate options for how they can get that done. This is where you as a seller start influencing the choices and trade-offs the buyers make about the options they choose to achieve their outcomes. And then really the third order decision, and the way I think sellers should look at it, is the third most important, or the third least important decision the buyer makes is who they can buy from.
Great. Well, a perfect kind of segue to understand where we might be able to find your book, where we can get in touch with you if we want to learn more, all of that stuff.
Well, thank you. So you can buy the book on Amazon or wherever you buy books. You can visit my website, andypaul.com, and we've got a fun little assessment quiz there. She's grabbing the book. Thank you.
Just so you can see it.
Got one here too. Never leave home without it. Is a little assessment, just maybe see how salesy you are. It's not scientific, but it's just sort of give you an indication. And then, people want to connect with me on LinkedIn, or they can email me at andy@andypaul.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Andy, for joining us on the Predictable Revenue Podcast. It was great having you. Learned a lot about changing from selling out to selling in, how to look at that from a strategic management perspective, and how to look at that if you are a sales rep yourself, kind of looking at the way that you sell and following the 4-pillar approach instead of some of the traditional salesy stuff. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. See you next time.